Alright guys, so I hear you did a great job with your questions yesterday, so I figured we'd do the exact same thing today. So let's take a look at your review questions. So we have questions 21 through 35 today. The first question you're going to look at, which I believe, I'm lying, we're looking at 22 through 35. First question is 22. So the question is, what is humanism? So humanism is a Renaissance school of thought that focused on the importance of human talents and successes over religious matters. So this would be saying something like, well, the athlete won their race because they were talented and worked hard, not because God willed them to win. In the past, it was the thought that, well, if they won, it's because God wanted them to win. And that's why, and then all of that credit should be given to God and not the athlete. Alright, for number 23, we're looking at Niccolo Machiavelli. So that's that looker on the right here. Okay, so he was a politician and a philosopher. He was the author of The Prince. So that's what you might see in your Regents exams and sometimes on tests. You'll see excerpts from The Prince. He believed that rulers should be feared, not loved, and that the ends, or like a successful government, justify the means, the terrible thing that the ruler does. So the ruler can do terrible things as long as in the end they end up with a successful government. Alright, number 24, we're looking at the Protestant Reformation. So in the 16th century, people started to question and move away from the Catholic Church. And this buddy with the fantastic hair over here is Martin Luther. So he created and distributed the 95 Theses, which were complaints against the Catholic Church. And he nailed those to a wall or to the door of a Catholic church in his area. So this is the one where, if I'm trying to give you the hint, I end up banging on the wall to say he nailed his 95 Theses. So many people had complaints about the Catholic Church, and so they started to move away from it. The people who moved away from the Catholic Church and were still Christian, they referred to themselves as Protestants. So think that they're protesting against the Catholic Church. Alright, so how did Louis XIV become an absolute monarch? So Louis XIV believed that he was God's representative on earth, and he only answered to God. So what he did is he centralized the French government, so he made it so that the central government, or essentially the king, had more power. They had more rights to do certain things. They'd say, okay, well, the king is in charge of deciding who gets to buy land, and the king is also in charge of deciding who gets to, build a factory. Not so much in this case, but they're just an example of centralizing that government. If you centralize that government and you give all that power to yourself, it essentially gives him complete power over his subjects, and he became an absolute monarch. He ruled completely. Alrighty, then we have our friend with the mustache, Peter the Great. And the reason Peter the Great is referred to as the Great is because he really tried to make positive changes. He tried to reform Russia, and he tried to modernize it as well, so kind of bring it up to modern standards. He embraced education. He really thought that education was important, and he thought it was really important for us to focus on scientific advancement. Okay, so he would encourage those things. He tried to make positive changes in Russia. Number 27, what was the scientific revolution? Okay, so this was in 16th and 17th century Europe. This was a time of major scientific change and discovery. So some major names you're going to want to remember from the scientific revolution is Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo, Descartes, Newton, Bacon. Okay, so we remember Copernicus because Copernicus was the one who originally came up with the idea that it seemed as if the planets revolved around the sun. Galileo was the one who eventually proved that with the telescope. Newton, we know from gravity, the idea of gravity. Okay, so all of these major scientific discoveries came about during the scientific revolution. Number 28, we're looking at what did the English Bill of Rights do to the government? Okay, Okay, so in this image you have an image of the Bill of Rights being delivered to the king and the queen. So in 1689, the English Bill of Rights gave Parliament control over the monarchy. This essentially turned the government into a constitutional monarchy. So the king and the queen still existed, as they still do exist today. There is still a monarchy. But this essentially gave Parliament the control to make the laws and make the decisions in the government. For number 29, we're looking at the encomienda system. Okay, so the encomienda system was a labor system created by the Spanish crown in the Americas, so created by the Spanish monarchy. The idea was that the Spanish settlers would use native labor in exchange for protection and support. So they would say, okay, to the natives who were living there, they would say, okay, you know, you will work for us. You will, mine this area or help grow these crops. In exchange, we're going to support you, make sure that you're living a good lifestyle, and we'll protect you from invaders or other tribes who would live in the area. That's not what it ended up being. So it essentially turned into the natives being enslaved by the Spanish settlers. Okay, so they just essentially were working in slavery at this point, and they started dying off from Spanish diseases because they had not been exposed to them yet, and this is pre-vaccine, so whatever they were exposed to, they were going to get. All right, mercantilism. When I talk about mercantilism, this economic system, I always say, you just need to remember, colonies benefit the mother country. Okay, the mother country gets the good end of this deal. So essentially what happens is that colonies export raw materials to the mother country, who then takes those raw materials, makes a manufactured good, and sells it back to the colonies. Okay, so maybe the colonies would create cotton. So colonies they grow and they harvest cotton. So they'll grow and harvest cotton, they ship that cotton over to the mother country, so let's think maybe Great Britain at this time, and the mother country then proceeds to maybe make shirts and pants and whatnot out of this cotton, and then they sell it right back to the colony. The colonies don't do business like this with each other. So the southern colonies aren't going to ship their cotton up to the northern colonies who are then going to make shirts. It's not going to happen. In this way, the mother country kind of stays in economic control of what's going on in the colonies. All right, let's look at the causes for exploration. So when we're thinking about the causes of exploration, we need to remember the 3 G's. So our first G is gold. Explorers wanted to find riches in distant lands. Second G is God. So they hoped to spread Christianity to the places that they traveled to, or the places that they explored. And they also wanted glory. They wanted to be known for discoveries. They wanted to gain power. They wanted to plot their flag on that land and be in the history books forever. So these were the big 3 causes for exploration. Number 32, why were the Spanish able to conquer the Aztecs and the Incas? So the Spanish had many advantages over these people, such as guns and horses. So if you're essentially fighting with spears as a native person and somebody comes in with on horseback with all these horses and they have guns, you don't stand much of a chance. Many natives also died from diseases brought in by the Spanish. This is what we were talking about before with the encomienda system. Number 33, what was the Columbian Exchange? So this is a spread of products and disease between Europe and the Americas. So as you can see in this map here, so these are products that went from the Americas to Europe. So these are things like pumpkins, turkeys, peanuts, potatoes, so on and so forth, and they get sent over to Europe. Well, then Europe sends back things like honeybees, bananas, grapes, citrus fruits. All these end up coming back to the Americas. They also sent livestock, so this is where the horses start to come over. And they also sent some wonderful diseases like smallpox, the flu, typhus, measles, just some wonderful stuff. So thank you, Europe. Number 34, what happened to Native Americans when the Europeans came? So many Native Americans were killed, either by fighting, disease, or being enslaved. Okay, so they were not treated very well. The Europeans didn't come in and say, oh, whoops, you were here first. They were like, you were going to take this now. So many were forced out of their territory. Again, they didn't have the technological advancements that the Europeans did. So the Native Americans didn't stand much of a chance. Plus, it's really hard to fight when the head of your tribe is dying of smallpox. And what were the effects of the transatlantic slave trade? There are quite a few. So many men were taken from Africa, and African nations fell into economic despair. Sorry about the bell, guys. So these African nations no longer had the men that they needed to support their governments. And support, not really their governments, but support their, families. This created deep divides between the rich white and the poor black communities in the New World, so we still see those effects today. And cotton production, which relied heavily on slave labor, increased drastically. Okay, so they're now able to produce more cotton, so that's going to go up, and it's going to be a big export. Okay, so I hope that this was helpful. And again, if you missed anything, just scroll on back, take time to pause, take time to look over your notes, and I will see you next week.